Okay, cool dudes and dudettes, world history. Where were we? We were talking about Russia because Russia was going through a revolution, a communist revolution, no less. This was a huge development because the United States, we weren't um, great friends, great allies with the Tsar, but we at least had a working relationship with him. Now, when Lenin first took over, there was a reaction on the part of Americans that, like, all right, maybe this guy talking, liberal policies, maybe he'll be a strong ally to the U.S. after all. But that doesn't wind up being the case. So it was a very significant development in terms of U.S. Russian relations because, like I said, up until this point, they had been kind of reluctant allies, sort of a frenemies situation. But as Russia really embraces communism, animosity or fear or suspicion on the part of Americans is going to continue to increase. Lenin, here we have Karl Marx. Get it? That's the Communist Party. Stalin, Castro, Lenin. Great stuff. Um, Lenin has a very famous quote: capitalists are no more capable of self sacrifice than a man is capable of lifting himself up by his own bootstraps. Lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps, that's now a colloquialism, meaning, being self made, basically. But Lenin was clearly very dubious of that. Vladimir Lynch Lenin. You will be required to memorize this spelling. Just kidding. He was chairman of the Council of the People's Commissars. He had a relatively short rule, 7 years. He took over for Alexander Kerensky, Alex, and he was succeeded by Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin is going to get his own PowerPoint. So if we make it through this one, then we're going to start on Stalin. Because Stalin's going to be the leader of Russia during World War II. So we're going to see a lot more. Stalin's going to be the leader of Russia for a long time. So the U.S. has a lot of interactions with him. Born in 1870 in Simbirsk, he died. He died young, 53. Of course, he was Russian. He was a Bolshevik, Bolshevik. This is sometimes called the Bolshevik Revolution. Vladimir Lenin was one of the leading political figures and revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. He masterminded the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia in 1917. Lenin was the architect and first head of state for the Soviet Union. He was exiled and expelled from university for his radical socialist democratic ideals. His beliefs evolved into a sub philosophy of Marxism called Leninism. So Lenin endorsed the compromisation of his Marxist teachings in the name of practical implementation both in the Soviet Union and the world at large. In other words, Lenin was heavily influenced by Marx, but he molded Marx's philosophy, the Marxism. He molded that to fit what he felt like was a more real world uh, option. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics. Freedom for slave owners. Yeah, not a huge fan of the United States was Lenin. He understood that Tsarism could only be overthrown by a revolt of the masses and believed that the masses should be headed by an elite group of dedicated revolutionists, revolutionaries, if you prefer, and intellectuals. Lenin did not think the exact same as the populist. And ultimately, he changes his opinion on how to best go about this revolution. Initially, he felt like the peasants should be in charge of this, but eventually he changed his mindset and he felt like it would be the urban proletariat, the city workers who would be led by the revolutionaries. And like I said, his attitude towards the development and his behaviors and policies when he entered leadership in Russia uh, really kind of built the foundation that their government is still built on today, although we all know the Soviet Union is no more. His contributions or his additions to Marxism, number one, he was highly critical of imperialism. In other words, Lenin did not agree with the US and these other European nations going out and taking over lands and basically setting up something that resembled a colonies. Lenin does place some importance on these colonies because he says that um, those areas, those people who are being subjugated, who are being put down, that those are the areas where you see revolution. He wanted the Revolutionary Party to be a disciplined unit as opposed to just a giant riot. And like I said, when Lenin was sort of molding his Marxist views, one of the main things he was concerned with was practical, staying practical. In other words, Lenin understood that, sure, maybe in his opinion, Marxism was a flawless uh, philosophy in theory, but Lenin felt that to implement a pure Marxist system just wouldn't be possible. And to suppress any theoretical changes, revisionism, or gradualism. So, any changes or kind of loosening of the Communist Party. He says if socialism can only be realized when the intellectual development of all the people permits it, then we shall not see socialism for at least 500 years. What's he saying there? He's basically saying, like, look, everybody doesn't have to be on board with this. socialism, if we're going to set it up, we're going to have to, we're going to have opposition, basically. Lenin talked about the necessity of revolution. He felt like it was the natural progression of society, that they were ready for a revolution. At that point, Russia was ruled by nobility and landowners. And really, there was a lot of conflict between different social classes. So there were these nobles, what we would think of today as an oligarch, who were just unbelievably wealthy. But a lot of the peasant community lived in abject poverty, right? They were struggling to eat, etc. Modern socialists, and this is about the impact of Lenin. Modern socialists argue that without Lenin, Russia would have fallen apart and really would have just collapsed after World War One. And he instigated or started these changes that brought about the powerful Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Hostile meaning mean to us, enemies. So let's take a look at this timeline. In 1898, Lenin joined the Social Democratic Party, which was a predecessor to um, Lenin's version of Marxism. He had been exiled prior to that, so he returns and joins the party. 7 years later, he participates in Bloody Sunday, and we talked about that yesterday. 7 years after that, Lenin, who at this point is the leader of the Bolsheviks, split from the Mensheviks to form their own political party. So the Bolsheviks are actually a branch off of the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks eventually really just sort of dissolved. 5 years after that, they tried to overthrow the government. They organized a coup. The Bolsheviks do in Petrograd, but it was unsuccessful. After that, Lenin has to go into hiding because he's now considered an enemy of the state. Right? He's literally trying to organize and overthrow the government, but they're not able to stop him. And November 6th, 1917, the Bolsheviks have officially claimed power. After the Bolsheviks were in charge, it was very easy for Lenin to basically take the role of Soviet dictator. That was his party, really, at that point. One thing Lenin wanted to do was to end all war ties. So he signed armistices, excuse me, that really allowed the Soviet Union to get out of the First World War. The problem is his early attempts to change the nation are going to be a colossal failure. They result in a widespread famine, and about 5 million people die. Some of starvation, others of hypothermia. They didn't have, adequate heat. Just any number of things: hunger, disease. Lenin implements something called the New Economic Policy, and that did allow some businesses in the Soviet Union to improve and temporarily helped out the situation. There's a reason we're talking about Lenin. Um, there are a lot of important Russians who were very important to Russia, but wouldn't really be relevant or would be a little bit too far off to be in the world history standards. We're talking about this particular Russian because his impact went way beyond Russia. That's kind of what it comes down to. Lemon also said, politics begin where the masses are, not where there are thousands, but where there are millions. That is where serious politics begin. Remember, Russia was an ally in World War One. So, of course, they fought against the Germans. They were uh, opponents. So Lenin was taking over the government that had previously gone to battle with Germany. So Germany was all about it. Eventually, they signed something called the Nazi Soviet Pact. And that's going to take place in the years leading up to World War II. Elsewhere, these revolutions were going on, not just in Russia. In China, they adopt a type of Leninism known as Leninism. Usually people just call it Maoism. The thing is, after Lenin dies, both Stalin and Mao Zedong, when it says claim to be the sole intellectual heirs of Lenin's thoughts, it basically means they're each saying, no, you're not his top disciple, I am. You're not the with Lenin dying, you're not the world expert on Leninism. I am. So there's this competition to see basically who the figurehead, who the top of the communist or Leninist food chain. The U.S. was not into this whole communist thing. Remember, initially they were like, all right, maybe this revolution will be a good thing. Because we weren't that tight with Russia before that. But once they became a superpower, they were at that point our opponent, our foe. We weren't fighting with them yet, but at that point they were a rival. I guess is probably the best way to put it. So the U.S. is basically saying, countries that are going to change their politics, if they're going to adopt communism, we're going to intervene. The USSR says, well, if you intervene to stop the spread of a communist regime, then we'll intervene to support it. We won't talk about the Reagan doctrine. That's a little too contemporary. We're not going to get into those either. So, why did Lenin lead his cause? What's his backstory? In May 1887, when Lenin was 17 years old, his eldest brother, Alexander, was arrested and hanged for participating in a terrorist bomb plot threatening the life of Tsar Alexander III. His sister Anna, who was with Alexander at the time of his arrest, was banished to the family estate in the village of Kokushino, about 40 kilometers from Kazan. This event radicalized Lenin, and his official Soviet biographies describe it as central to the revolutionary track of his life. He grew to despise the Tsardom. The phrase, "we will follow a different path," refers to Lenin choosing a Marxist approach to a popular revolution instead of an anarchist or individualist methods. His mother mentioned this to him and inspired Lenin to fight for a Soviet future. As Lenin became interested in Marxism, he was involved in student protests and was subsequently arrested. This gave him further time to study what had effectively become his Bible, and Lenin became more and more interested in holding a revolution. Remember, one of his first tasks was to disengage from the war. So he did not want Russia to go to war. He was also very critical of large businesses that controlled a sector of the economy, monopolies. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and the provincial government was relatively weak. Lenin saw a chance for change and turned the Russia into the USSR. He was very concerned about creating a free, universal healthcare system for all, the rights of women, and teaching Russian people how to read. How Lenin came to power. In the First World War, the Germans knew Lenin would be the source of political and particularly military control. The Germans put him on a train and sent him back to Russia. Russia suffered a lot in the later stages of the war. The Imperial Army had not fared well at all. It had lost repeatedly to the Germans. It even had trouble against the armies of the Austro Hungarian Empire. The people of Russia were ready for a change. Lenin had spread secret propaganda and organized for factories and various labor officials to work in the subtle good of their cause. Lenin and his Marxist views were readily accepted when he arrived in Russia. The Tsar was not able to contain the Marxist problem. The October Revolution pursued, and this led to the fall of the Romanovs' dynasty and the end of Imperial Russia. Lenin then set about making changes to Russia. One was the first One of the first was to withdraw from the war. This freed up all the troops on the Eastern Front. The Germans were thus relieved of the two front war, but not in time to save their situation. Vladimir was respected by the Soviets and the international community alike, whether or not they approved of his views. This recognition was the final stage of Lenin's dominance over Russia. It is true that liberty is precious, so precious that it must be carefully rationed. A lie told often enough becomes truth. Lenin was both a politician and a murderer. The revolution which he set into motion, his effect on the international populations, and how he entertained a political and social philosophy that caused the death of countless Soviets and their enemies alike, made Lenin a significant figure in the 20th century. When one makes a revolution, one cannot mark time. One must always go forward or go back. He who now talks about the freedom of the press goes backward and halts our headlong course towards socialism. Well, guys, with that, I think we'll call it a day. This lesson's going to be posted here, week 4, 3 lesson. And then, I'm not going to give you an assignment tomorrow. So we'll go ahead and X that one out. Okay, guys, I hope you're having a good time with your family. Be nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents nuts. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.